with a panel called On How Many Futures for the EU. I believe that yesterday's panels have set the scene for today's discussion. And as you can hear, my voice is not the best. So I'll use yesterday's almost 6 hours of talks for the scene setter. I won't dwell on it. I will just point to 3 elements said yesterday. And then the organizers have been very kind to spare me further from my voice. And we will have a short 3-minute video as a scene setter then for a discussion. And after that video, I will invite my distinguished panel to the podium, and we will then start. So yesterday's panels, I think, have shown, I imagine you agree with me, at least to an extent, quite a bleak analysis of the future of Europe. What stayed with me was the era of abundance is over. If you Google it now, it's full of, in any possible language, already the discussions on what President Macron meant with that and what does it mean, the sacrifices we will have to take, and whether it's limited to France only. The second one was Foreign Minister Schallenberg. We've been thrown out of paradise, from paraphrasing Robert Kagan. And the third one, the Slovenian Prime Minister saying, we need a new way. We have to do it differently. No country has patience to wait for 10 years. Now, this brings our discussion of the futures of the EU together with discussions of the futures of Europe, and I will use these terms interchangeably because I think no future of the EU can be discussed without the future of Europe. And as we will be discussing today, this analysis, but complementing it with the assessment of the options for the future, giving advice for the course of action to the policymakers, we'll be focusing ourselves on 3 elements, which are pretty encompassing pretty much everything there is to discuss. The first one is the strength of our democracy at every level, local, regional, member state, and European. We'll be looking into how to pursue Europe's interests globally and defend and promote our values. So how to strengthen our voice and capacity for action in that, for those objectives. And thirdly, how to ensure security and prosperity for our citizens. So democracy, global Europe, and security and prosperity for our citizens. I will stop here, and I invite you to this 3-minute video, and then we'll start the panel.
It started with a story. Europa, the stunning Phoenician princess. And Zeus, the mighty king of the gods. Enamored of Europa, Zeus abducted the young princess and carried her across the sea. Europa's new home would see its share of history in the centuries to follow. And the future? In a world of numerous unknowns, there is a multitude of possible developments. We know now that the history did not end, and nothing is impossible. Let's imagine a few scenarios. Europe in 2050. The political divisions and disagreement about core European values and a common future have reached the point of no return. Years of disinformation and rising nationalism have dealt democracy a devastating blow. The rise of populist regimes and the economic downturn led to some European countries adopting policies that unsettle the markets. This breaks apart the Eurozone and, shortly, the European Union itself. New conflicts erupt, and the cradle of Western civilization drifts into disarray and irrelevance. In another scenario, economic interests prevail. In this future, the reluctance to abandon the economic benefits of EU membership suppresses the divisions. The pandemic leaves the Union institutionally stronger in fiscal and health policies, Yet cooperation on security and defense remains weak. Innovation intensifies, but it's still lagging behind global leaders. The inability to adapt is gradually eroding the EU's voice in global affairs. In yet another alternate future, Europe reaches the ultimate stage of an ever closer union. Several member states take advantage of the enhanced cooperation, and a union within the union gradually emerges. New enlargement completes the consolidation of the continent, and soon more members join the core group. A much more robust and advanced form of integration, Europe becomes the global leader in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and robotics. Its sheer economic power renders Europe the main creator of international standards in the environment, privacy, and consumer rights, among others. In addition to its formidable soft power, Europe now also has a sizable military force. We can anticipate alternative realities, but we cannot predict. There are many things that we can act upon, and even more that are beyond our control. Anticipating and preparing to withstand in the yet unknown is what makes us resilient. Accepting the uncertainty, embracing the future.
Please join me in congratulating the Artistic Director of the Bled Strategic Forum, Žiga Pirnat, for, thank you Žiga, providing us with these 3 thought-provoking options. May I invite the panel to join me on the podium? And while you are all getting settled, allow me to include the audience. It is an early hour, so let me wake you up. After having seen these thought-provoking 3 options, allow me to ask you to vote on the 3 of them now, and then let's see what 75 minutes of debate, 57 minutes of debate, if they might change your mind. Now, I think the major contours of the 3 options have been presented well, so I'll ask you to raise your hands for the respectively Ares, Hermes, and Athena option, as you personally believe is possible from what you know now about the capacity of EU, European institutions and politicians to choose the course of action, and of course also of the citizens' wishes and, well, let's say, yeah, wishes, let's stay with that. So, who votes for the Ares option? The 2050 was there as a benchmark. 1, and my quick judgment suggests this is the youngest person in the room. Now I'm worried. Who votes for the Hermes option? That's a bit more cross-generational, if I may say. This is not quite Eurovision. I think I counted 12. And Athena? Thank you very much. Let's see if we can make this happen. So I invited the panel to provide assessment and advice for the action based on the analysis that we have, and also add to the analysis, of course. We have 6 panelists, 54 minutes to go, I think. I will ask an initial question to all of them. And then we will elaborate on their answers in a conversation between the panelists. Then I will pass the floor on to Mr. Peterle, who's our first listener and who will ask thought-provoking questions both to you but also to the panelists. And then I will involve you, and I believe there will be microphone coming around. And I hope to have 2 or 3 rounds of questions to the panelists. Now, let me also take my seat. So we have I have to say for Blit, a very decent panel of 6, so thank you very much to the organizers. And the panel is also, I would say, special in the sense that it combines politicians, acting politicians, former politicians, academics, think tankers, and I believe this is already a good sign for the discussions to come. We will start with Minister Byrne, Irish Minister for European Affairs. Welcome. I'll present the whole panel very quickly before we start. We will continue with State Secretary Štucin, State Secretary for European Affairs. Then Maria João Rodrigues, welcome to the panel. I think very well known also to the Blitz Strategic Forum, former member of the European Parliament. Then Guillaume Klossa, I believe you've seen him in action last night. Guillaume is, of course, the founder of EuropaNova, but also Senior VP at Hill+Knowlton, and a writer who's, I believe, one of the books at least inspired the title of this panel. We will continue then with Charles Powell from Real Instituto Elcano and finish off with Charles Grant, both director of the Center for European Reform, London. Minister Byrne, the title is How Many Futures for Europe, or for the EU? You will have noticed, as I said, I will be using these interchangeably. Do you use this interchangeably? What's your perspective of the many futures for the EU or Europe? And of course, the relationship between the European Union and Europe in that respect.
Well, I have to be honest, I think there's one future for the EU, and that is the EU itself. The EU is not perfect, but it is the greatest peace process in the history of the world. The EU is the greatest collaboration, the greatest integration of countries in the history of the world, in my opinion. It's one of the greatest innovations in our democracy. It's certainly not perfect. When we look to the future here and we talk about the EU being the standard setter for privacy, for climate, for consumer rights, I mean, it already is the standard setter for all of those, in my opinion. Again, not perfect. Maybe the standards aren't exactly what we all want, but not perfect. We don't have vetoes. In day-to-day life, in those areas at least. And I think I'm very hopeful about the future, but I think that the future has to be the European Union, not variations of it, not certainly not the destruction of the European Union. And within that, yes, we will make changes from time to time to have things move better. But overall, it's still going to be the European Union as we know it, the sharing of sovereignty, the democratic principles, the values of human rights and the rule of law that underpin everything. I think it's certainly going to be there and certainly going to continue doing its work. And really, some of the changes that we talk about on a day-to-day basis, I believe in the overall scheme of things, you know, aren't huge. I mean, the big decision was to come together to pool sovereignty. Other further decisions, a single market, for example, common foreign and security policy, some of the changes in the Lisbon Treaty. I really believe that some of the other stuff is really around the edges. And yes, we are at a pivotal moment in history, there's no doubt, with war on the European continent. But even then, I think, despite our flaws, despite our imperfections, we've shown ourselves as a European Union that is relatively agile and relatively able to react, notwithstanding that we're not a defence alliance. So I'm very hopeful about the future, and I'm very hopeful about the present as well.
Thank you very much. So one future, and that future is the EU. State Secretary Štucin, I imagine you agree?
Well, I definitely agree. And first of all, I have to say that there is one future. But the problem is we don't know what this future is. And we, as the representatives of the governments or European institutions or citizens, we have to make sure that this future that we will be living in the next 10, 20, 30 years will simply be the best one. We know what we want from our future, and from Slovenian side I can say that we definitely would like to see European Union, that it's safe, that's secure, that's resilient, and that protects our common values on which the European Union was built. I would maybe like to mention also the geographical aspects of the discussion. and maybe go back to what President Powell said yesterday at the opening of that strategic forum. We are all aware of the situation we are in. We are all aware of the geopolitical turbulence or crisis, or however you put it. The thing is that in Europe, we fear that there may be a new bloc division becoming a reality. And in this situation, European Union needs to make sure that we will stick together and clearly define what and who we are. And here I would really like to, we're repeating this over and over again, say that we should not forget about the Western Balkans countries. It's the region in the middle of the European Union. We can say it's almost terra incognita for the most of Europe, unfortunately. But it's the region that I mean, we used to think the Western Balkan countries needs Europe, needs European Union, but we need them. We need them, especially now. And we should not forget about this, and whatever future we live in the next 10, 20, 30 years, it should include Western Balkans.
Thank you very much. A very clear statement here. Maria João Rodrigues.
Well, I would say that the European project has been shaped by two major processes. One is enlargement, and another one is deepening. And we should ask, what should you do now? And in fact, there are different futures. That's why the panel today is so relevant. And there are different choices. My point would be, say, we need to go for enlargement, starting with the Balkans, and then we have also the offer of candidacy to Ukraine and Moldova. This is a moral and political imperative. But I would say that also need deepening. So my point is that we need not to choose between either enlargement or deepening. We need both with different new approaches. This is my point. On enlargement, a new approach, because in fact we need to have a political approach and geopolitical approach. And when it takes the economic dimension of enlargement, we also need to involve these countries in our European networks, in better European coordination. When it comes deepening, in the past, others will call for a special organized club, directoire. I don't think we need this. We just need to have the instruments with the capacity to decide and to act inside the European Union. And we need to have stronger instruments, because we need to have stronger strategic autonomy. We need to move to a new development model. We need to have the budgetary capacity to support this. And this only happens if we have a major, stronger democratic drive in the European Union. So these are my ideas to start with.
Thank you very much. Now we do have a differentiation here. I believe many of you have been studying these affairs and recognize the widening versus deepening dilemma. And with this, Maria João Rodrigues also introduced the current debates that have been launched by President Macron, Charles Michel on the European political community, European geopolitical community, but also ideas on further federation by Enrique Letta and others. Now we continue with Guillaume Klossa. I believe it's been a decade or over a decade ago you wrote a book titled Europe, la dernière chance. Sounds quite bleak, but it's been a decade, and now we're discussing about the futures of Europe. And if you have read the concept note for the panel, it said also that the EU is not a cat, it only has one life. So how many futures for Europe, and whether this was the la dernière chance already a decade ago, if this was, where are we now?
So first of all, I agree with Maria João Rodrigues, so I will not elaborate on this. 10 years ago, indeed, I published this book, and this book was based upon the work I made for the European Council on the future of Europe. And at the time, we have identified for 2020 7 drivers. Democracy needs to be revived, and we need to invent the next transnational European democratic step. First, sustainability is not an option. Third, energy will need a real European policy. Fourth, tech will drive growth and need to be put at the service of human. 5, we need a European defense because we don't know how long we can be supported by the US. War is anew possible in Europe. 6, geopolitics, we are in a rebalancing of power, and we need to listen and to discuss with the world. And 7, health will be key for Europeans. So that were 7 drivers. 12 years ago, they are now at the heart of European politics. So the question for me is, for European citizens, Europe has gone, has went on, and finally, if we look back, there was a big risk of fragmentation. We work on that with Maria. And we have avoided fragmentation. And somehow the Brexit helped us to be more united. This is a paradox, and helped us also to build together. Without the UK, with the UK, it would have been much more difficult. And my feeling is we would not have been in a position to cope with the COVID or to act as we are acting now with regard to the war. So it's a very important point. The question for me is, for European citizens, Europe is something which is only responsive. And at a certain moment, when you are only responsive and reactive, you are tiring. For me, politics is very Machiavellian. I like this word of Machiavel, who was saying, take the lead in order to implement the new order of things. And I think we are exactly in this period where Europe needs to take the lead in order to implement this new order of things if it wants to be inclusive, both for member states and for citizens. And the second thing, very quickly, I just wrote a book on European civilization, and we have a 2-hour discussion yesterday evening with Zizek on this issue. And the topic is, as President Zelensky said, Europe is embodying a new, the EU is embodying a new civilization, which is not a war civilization, but a peaceful civilization. And the question is, Europe is a kind of political embodiment of this civilization, the EU, and we need to build a new narrative around that, because we are in a war of narrative and civilization, and Europe needs to have one if it wants to survive.
Right. I think we'll elaborate on that narrative in subsequent discussions, but let me move on now to Charles Powell. One Europe, several Europes, one future, several futures?
I'm very sanguine about the future of the European Union. To use Chris Patton's famous expression, I'm a federast. And I'm really quite optimistic about the future of the EU. Having said that, and listening very closely, very attentively to yesterday's debates, which I think were very interesting, my main fear at the moment is that perhaps the European Union is becoming incompatible with a more unified Europe as a whole. What do I mean by this? Obviously, the EU will always be the core element of the future of the European continent. But there is a very real danger that we are leaving behind many non-EU member states. The Western Balkans, of course, but also Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. And I'm glad you mentioned Enrico Letta's idea of a European confederation. Of course, the word confederation is controversial for obvious reasons. But, you know, listening to the Spanish foreign minister, he said that the main priority of the Spanish presidency of the EU will be European unity. And that's fine and dandy. But the problem is, how do we bridge the gap between the EU and non-EU member states? Now, this is a strategic forum, so let's do a little thinking out of the box. I don't know whether we need a treaty to bring together the EU 27 plus the 9, in other words, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and the Western Balkans, or whether looser arrangements will suffice. But the main point that I would like to stress is that there is a real danger that we are leaving these countries behind. I think both Macron and Letta were effectively acknowledging that these countries are not converging with the EU at an adequate rate. So, as João Rodrigues was saying, you know, we have to go back to this old debate about deepening versus enlargement. I have always believed that historically they have been compatible. In fact, we have often deepened as a result of enlargement, or to prepare for enlargement, to be more precise. And I think that can continue to be the case. So my main concern right now is, you know, what kind of constellation, what kind of policies can we actually generate from the hard core, from the EU, to assist non-EU members to converge with a view to eventually becoming members of the European family. And I think that since we're talking about this here in Bled, Slovenia, this is really the most important conversation that we can have right now.
Thank you very much. And we conclude with Charles Grant. I have seen your piece advocating or urging the British government to pay attention to what's happening on the continent, in particular to the closer political cooperation on the continent. So now we've had the concept introduced, European political cooperation versus confederation, perhaps. What's your views? What are your views on that?
Well, I think we do need more than one Europe. The most important Europe, as Thomas Byrne said, is of course the European Union, and that will be the core of whatever happens in the rest of Europe, I'm sure, in terms of economics and perhaps in the future in security too. But it's not enough on its own. The European Union is trying quite hard to do more in defence, and I applaud its efforts. There's an important European Defence Fund. There's a plan for a 5,000-strong rapid reaction force. But if you want to stand up to Russia and China and have as much geopolitical weight as possible, you need a broader, wider organisation. I think Macron understands that. He's proposed a few years ago this thing called the European Intervention Initiative, which is not a very important organisation at the moment, has the potential to become important. It's an idea of getting about a dozen members, more sort of serious military powers, to adopt a common military culture and work together in the defence sphere. But I do think his idea of the European political community is important. I mean, it's got a number of different rationales. One is that the neighbourhood policy isn't working very well. Another is you've got to find a forum to include Turkey somehow. Another is you've got to do more for the Western Balkans until enlargement can reach the Western Balkans. Another is to socialise the British, so the British don't cut off their links to Europe entirely. And I do think the idea of a club where the European countries can sit together and talk about big strategic challenges, whether it's how to deal with Russia or energy issues or infrastructure or climate issues, is very important. And for this, in terms of Europe as a geopolitical actor, you do have to find ways of including the British. It's rather difficult because they don't want to be included at the moment. I actually asked Liz Truss about 6 weeks ago at a conference, you know, what's your view on the European political community? She's not in favour, I'm afraid. But the EU countries are going to have to be patient. In the long run, there will be a British government that wants to have closer links with the EU. And I'll finish with this. I mean, I think that Keir Starmer is quite like to be the next British Prime Minister, in my view. I may be wrong on that, but we'll see. He's the Labour leader. He's not going to want to rejoin the EU, or he won't even want to rejoin the single market or the customs union or restore freedom of movement. But he will want a better relationship. He will want to have a much closer, more constructive relationship to revisit many of the problems. I think, as Thomas Byrne knows all about the Northern Ireland Protocol, he would certainly want to compromise on the protocol and be more flexible on that. He would want to, I believe, join the European political community. He'd want to have structured links on foreign and defence policy. He would want to do a deal on plant and animal health to reduce a lot of the friction at the border. So I think in all sorts of ways we can expect a more constructive relationship between the UK and the EU in the long run. But the EU's going to have to be patient because Mrs Truss, who's almost certainly going to be the next Prime Minister, isn't going to help in that respect.
Thank you very much. This concludes our first round. I'm looking at the clock. I think we can do another round among the panelists. So let me just build on your initial remarks. Minister Byrne, you sound very optimistic. I won't say tragically optimistic in reference to yesterday Edi's Rama's remarks, if you might recall them. If I can ask you for a few ideas or singling out a few edges that need to be brushed for the EU to be able to widen. You're very optimistic, small reforms are necessary, but if we are to enlarge, and we will enlarge, or EU is to enlarge, how could it accept or assimilate, no, that's not a good word, how could it accept further members?
Well, just on the whole point of enlargement, the whole point of enlargement and deepening, which has been mentioned, and obviously they do go hand in hand, I think we have to be very careful that we're bringing everybody along with us as well. So while the Irish public, for example, would be very in favour of enlargement, enthusiastically in favour of enlargement of the EU, the Irish public may not be as enthusiastic on deepening of powers, particularly in some areas such as defence and tax, for example. And yet the opposite is probably the case in some other member states where maybe the public aren't quite as in favour of enlargement but would be in favour of deepening. So I think what we have to do is that we have to be very, very careful that we're bringing the public with us, the citizens for whom this EU project exists. And I think that's why all of these issues are very, very important. But when we discuss them, we've got to make sure we're bringing the public with us, because I think if the public feel that the politicians are racing ahead of them, they may react in an unfavourable or a negative way. And in many countries, if we're to proceed with these futures that we're talking about, we may have to have referendums, not for enlargement in Ireland, but possibly for enlargement in some countries, but certainly for deepening in Ireland and some other member states. So I think we have to make sure that citizens are very much part of that conversation. Yes, the citizens clearly understand the challenges, but I think we've a constant challenge ourselves to explain to the citizens what we have and what we want. I think we have to be constantly optimistic about the future, because there are so many others who simply reminisce about the past and talk about the good old days or look back to ancient times. I think we have to have the past as a guide, but very much as a guide to our future rather than dwelling in the past. I think that danger is there. We see with populists right across this continent who are glorifying the past. And we have to be very, very careful, I think, to promise and work for a realistic, better future for all of our people.
Let me link the taking the citizens with us with what State Secretary Štucin said, that we know what we want. That reminded me of a quote from the former president of the European Commission, who said, "We all know what we need to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected afterwards." Now, he solved that problem for himself by not running, but how... I was wondering when he said the quote if he had it on his mind already back then. But how do we in our democracy solve that problem? And in particular, State Secretary Štucin, where do you see the challenges here with regard to the widening, with regard to the enlargement?
Well, maybe we can paraphrase JF Kennedy. So what can we do for the European Union? So I can maybe... first of all, what I said before, that European Union needs to be more secure, safer, more resilient. It would be better to say the other way around. The member states needs to be able to make European Union more secure, more stable, and more resilient. So at many discussions there's this question, so what we are going to do, how we are going to tackle the issue. We are tackling the issue every day. I mean, the mechanisms of European Union are, I have to say, in a way, an amazing colossum of work that is going on every day at the institutions, at the member states. And we need to keep doing it. We need to keep going on. Now, when it came out of the COVID crisis, we may had the feeling that we did it in a way okay as the European Union, but the war in Ukraine did prove that we are too weak. especially what regards our common foreign and security policy. We have to admit we are too weak. And can we afford this weakness? That's the question. If the war ends tomorrow, relations with the Russian Federation will not be good for a decade at least. And can we afford this weakness as the European Union? And my answer to you again, how? We need to keep doing it. And we need to as a member states, do more. That's the only answer. Now, regarding the Western Balkans, and what we are advocating are concrete steps, one by one, country by country. For example, candidate status for Bosnia and Herzegovina, visa liberalization for Kosovo. So we're not talking about a new philosophy for the Western Balkans, but very concrete steps that we all know that are needed. We just need to do them. That's my answer.
Thank you very much for bringing the member states in. Mr. Rodrigues, you talked about stronger institutions, but it's the member states that also make the institutions. We have the herende verträge. What do you see can the member states or must do now as the start to make the European institutions stronger?
Well, I will answer to your question, but let me also react to what was said by the panel previously. I do think that this proposal of the European political community is interesting in the sense of creating a stronger unity of Europeans in political and geopolitical terms, and this is necessary, taking into account the new global order we are driving in. But I have 3 bets about this. This should not be used to delay the enlargement process, because I fully agree with you, the enlargement process should be taken in a more quicker way and with a new approach. I am not repeating what I just said. My second bet is that this unity of Europeans in face of the global order should really be based on the full understanding what is the new global order. I think that the unity of the West is important, but this is no longer enough to ensure the future of the European project. We need to have a stronger multilateral system, which is now really being challenged, to frame this multipolar world which is in front of us and will go on being. So the West alone, if this is united, will no longer be enough to tackle this situation. So this is in our interest to renew the multilateral system. My third bet is about your question is, this should not also deter deepening, because I really believe that this time we need to make enlargement and deepening at the same time. In a coordinated, I'm not saying in precise the same time, but in a coordinated sequence, in a strategic sequence. And so my last point is about exactly how to deepen. Because I don't think we need particular clubs, as they were called for some 20 years ago. We don't need this. We need to make the European Union something more effective to decide and to act. So this depends on introducing qualified majority voting in certain areas, which are now a bit blocked. This depends on us to ensure stronger financial means. The COVID experience shows this is possible. We have created a stronger budgetary capacity to deal with a common problem. And now we have a new one, which is the energy transition and energy security is a vital interest of all Europeans. I agree with you that all this is only possible if we have citizens with us. But on this, I would have a positive word, because if we see the experience of the Conference on the Future of Europe, we saw a quite amazing situation of cities from all over Europe with a lot of common ground and calling for more important advances of the European project. But of course, we need to prepare this with citizens.
Right, thank you very much. Mr. Klossa, Mr. Štucin said we just have to do it. And you said Europe has to take the lead. Why, where are the obstacles? Why isn't Europe perhaps taking the lead, or what needs to be done to make this leading happen?
First of all, we have made a lot of things the last year. I mean, the way we reacted to the pandemic, the way we were united with regard to Brexit, which was a very huge thing to manage, the way we remain relatively united with regard to Russia, the fact that we are understanding that solidarity is not something coming from the north and Germany to the south for Greece, Spain, and Italy or France, but that solidarity is something which can concern anybody, and this is really something really important. Solidarity with the COVID was for everybody, with the war was for initially the eastern country, and now with the energy crisis it is for Germany. The paradigm is changing, but the fact is we need to change the narrative. Europe can't be the EU can't be anymore a Franco-German project. It should be a project from everybody. And there we need to come back to the root of the European project post-war, because what we saw post-war is from Poland to Portugal, from Greece to the UK, there were people who wanted to reinvent altogether the world. And we need to base this narrative in order to include people. I think the narrative is really, really important to give a new impetus. And it's not very difficult to develop. The second thing is, Maria spoke about the conference on the future of Europe, which is based somehow on the experience there was in Ireland with the civic convention. And this experience is really, really important. When you sort 1,000 citizens from everywhere in Europe, from any kind of social class or origin, 95% of them don't know anything about Europe, anything. But if you ask them to behave as European, they behave as European. And they behave as informed and responsible citizens. And the fact is, if we want to go ahead, we really need to find ways to include much more massively European citizens, and we need also to develop a shared civic education, which was one issue, one recommendation of the conference. Last point, which is very important. Okay, we need deepening, but I think in terms of narrative, and somehow I agree with the minister, but I disagree with him, the question is not more or less Europe. The question is a Europe which is capable of answering the challenges. And my feeling is the last 5 years we had huge challenges, but the challenges to come are much bigger. And with the institution we have, we can't cope. So if we do not fine-tune the institution, we are going to die. And we need to explain that, because citizens want an effective Europe, but as it works, it can't be effective any longer, because the institutions are exhausting. I was speaking this morning with people from the European Commission, and they told me there are several DG who are sick or who are dying. I spoke with the ambassador to the EU in Brussels. We are dead. We can't go on with this system because it's exhausting. It requires so much energy. So we need to develop rapidly a system which can be resilient. People which are managing the European system are completely exhausted at the moment, and we have to keep that in mind. We are not ready physically for the next crisis.
Let me stay on the narrative. Charles Powell, you introduced before that we need a new narrative. The old narrative of peace, we see that it doesn't resonate with today's generation at all anymore. I think we tend to forget that at the beginning of the European integration, so at the end of the Second World War, there was another narrative that somehow got pushed away by the predominant peace narrative. And that narrative was the prosperity for the European citizens, also in view of ensuring that, let's say, certain isms of in between wars times do not repeat. So that was a narrative that was for example, was you can observe it in the Common Agricultural Policy, and you can observe it also in institutions or advisory bodies such as the European Economic and Social Council. Not very important, but as I said, that narrative was pushed aside. What would be today's new narrative, or maybe in relation to what Guillaume presented?
Well, the problem here, I think, is that the real narrative is not a very sexy one. And the real narrative, to my mind, is quite simply this. The European Union is the best answer that we Europeans can ever possibly give to the question, how do we deal with globalization and its many challenges? The European Union is the best instrument that we have devised to maximize the potential benefits and minimize the potential downsides of globalization. Now, obviously, our citizens aren't going to be very enthused if we talk to them in these terms. But if you think about it, I think this is ultimately what the European Union of the 21st century is going to be. As you rightly said, the war and peace narrative doesn't mean much to younger people in particular, although, of course, Ukraine is changing that to some extent. Whether or not this is the end of abundance, again, our societies have become soft, they've become accustomed to unprecedented levels of prosperity. So it has to be, I think, something a little bit more sophisticated, but also, unfortunately, therefore, harder to explain. But can I just come back to a couple of things that have been mentioned very briefly? And it's interesting that it hasn't been mentioned yet. Treaty reform. You've been asking us, how do we deepen? Well, we had this conference on the future of Europe, which was a fantastic exercise. But what is the outcome of this conference on the future of Europe? Frankly, very disappointing. And this is partly because there is no appetite for treaty reform, for very solid, sound reasons. Now, if we can't have treaty reform, because this would probably undermine the internal cohesion of the EU at a crucial juncture, what kind of deepening is actually viable? Well, as Maria João and others were saying, possibly rather piecemeal measures, including QMV. Secondly, may I also express my surprise, the fact that Macron's ideas have gained so little traction. I think Macron is an impressive European leader, and I applaud him, and I'm very grateful to him for being so creative. But it's interesting how little success his ideas have had, probably because they're too vague, they're too self-serving, and they're too unilateralist. But ultimately, the substance of what he's saying is very important, and that is, as I said at the beginning, there seems to be a growing tension between the EU and Europe as a whole.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we opened the debate much broader now, but Charles Grant, let me finish with you with a very straightforward question. How do you do EU in the center, but not an EU-centric Europe to be appealing to Britain in the future?
Well, let me just first, I will get to that question, but first of all, so there's a word nobody's mentioned today, which is NATO. NATO is a rather important organization. It's become much more important because of the Ukraine war. I'm all for European strategic autonomy, I'm all for European defense, but the reality is that NATO and American involvement keeps Europe safe from Russia and other significant threats at the moment. There is, of course, a risk that America might pull out of NATO. Let's not forget that Donald Trump very nearly did so last time he was president. I think that's unlikely that America would leave NATO, but it's not impossible, which is why Guillaume and others are quite right to say Europe needs to do everything it can to build up its strategic autonomy as quickly as possible. But the reality is that NATO, including the Americans and the British, is going to be quite an important part of European defence for a while to come. I think what Charles is absolutely right to say that Macron would be more effective as a leader if he did some diplomacy and tried to build coalitions before launching new ideas like the European political community. He's quite effective anyway. He'd be much more effective if he learnt some diplomacy. Laurence Boone talked about the EPC yesterday on her panel. I was rather, so nobody else mentioned it. I think the French do have a marketing job to do and to try and persuade people to come round to this idea. When I was in Paris recently, there are two schools of thought about the EPC. One is that it should be very much dominated by the European Commission. It should be giving other countries in Europe, like those in the Western Balkans, access to parts of the single market before they can join the EU properly. The other version is a more intergovernmental talking shop. If it's the former version, the British will not be interested, I'm afraid, because if it's dominated by the European Commission and the whole EU, and it becomes EU plus, then the British will be quite small vis-à-vis the Commission and the rest of the EU, so the British will not be interested. If it's a more intergovernmental talking club, I think the British can be persuaded to take part. As several people have said, it is very important that the EPC is not seen as an alternative to enlargement. Macron made the mistake in his initial outlining of the scheme and not making that point clear, and his officials admit that they made a bit of a mistake there, but I think that should improve. That's getting better now. Finally, I think how many Europes do you need? I think Macron occasionally says the Eurozone needs its own institutions, different from those of the EU. I think he's right. I think the countries in the Eurozone do need to integrate quite a lot more than those that are not in the Eurozone. In the long run, there's a certain logic to leading towards a tighter Eurozone that doesn't include all the other members that are not in the Eurozone.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me invite Mr. Alojz Peterle now from the podium as the first response. I will take 30 seconds for the introduction, though I believe you know Mr. Peterle as a long-term MEP, former Prime Minister of Slovenia and Foreign Minister, and also you were the representative of, I believe then, candidate countries on the Conference on the Future of Europe. Now, while we are listening to Mr. Peterle, can I invite you to indicate to me if you have succinct questions to the panel only? And I'll keep the list.
Thank you very much. It is a privilege to be so many times former as I am. And I feel also privileged to have this special right to speak as the first listener. And thank you to the panelists for very concrete ideas, but also for the energy and optimism. Yesterday we had the chance to listen our leaders, then we were refreshed by night owls during the night with intellectual refreshments. And I think that as far as diagnosis is concerned, we are quite okay, and we share many ideas in this regard. I was attentive to the word abundance, that abundance is over. What is not just President Macron's conviction, but there is another word which was not used, but I will use it intentionally. I think it's time, a time is approaching or is still here, which we are not accustomed to it. Now I think that we will have as a union to sacrifice many things. And when you have to sacrifice, then you have to invest in a different way than in the time of growth. And also question of solidarity gets into another context in that regard. But I'm happy that after all these discussions, I can say that I didn't hear anybody to say to speak about the better answer than Europe, and I'm happy with that. The answer is community, and no country can find solution on its own. Unity means to keep together, but we only can keep together if we really share the same values and principles and rules, I would add. And we were able to enlarge European Union in several steps successfully, but we don't have yet truly united Europe. I will not speak about Schumann's or Delors' idea about the soul, but this is another expression of the spirit of unity. You mentioned attentively my time in the European Convention. I remember how much we spoke about different speeds, about different circles and so on. I would say that different speeds are not a problem in the context of the same future, but we cannot have different directions, different orientations of the same time. I remember that, or we all know that the Lisbon Treaty allows those who wish to do more enhanced cooperation. This is one possibility, but there is also so-called passerelle, which allows the decision on QMV if member states wish to do so in unanimous way. So we can do more if we wish so. Of course, there is no clear direction without vision. I would like to finish with some of questions. My first question is to the panelists. There is no, I mean, if I would comment 6 panelists, then I will lose too much time. I agree on what was said about enlargement, deepening. I was happy to hear that health is one of the priorities and so on. I was happy by so much attention to the Western Balkans, but let's go now to the question. What do you think? This is my first question. How can we produce or assure more political will? I don't think that the treaty is the main point, and I think we are not able to change the treaty very quickly. But what can we do to strengthen the political will? Then I have to ask a question on Western Balkans. There is a so-called new approach in the air. Somebody spoke about new approach as well. I think my former colleague from the European Parliament, Maria Rodrigues, mentioned new approach. We have to overcome this frustrating status of accession process in Western Balkans. And we have Ukraine, we have Moldova. We saw how NATO was quickly enlarged, but we cannot do the same with the Western Balkans as European Union. So my question is, do you have concrete ideas how to make accession process for Western Balkans more credible? Something that we have to invent something, not to overjump this offer from 2003 for full membership of Western Balkan countries, but what can we do in between to get closer, let's say. So, and then my last question. 1 year ago, we spoke here a lot about Central Europe. We spoke about gap between Western and Central Europe. My question is, do you think that we get a little bit closer in this regard? Because we can have one future and common future only if we really share the same values and principles. But I think that we are still quite different in some basic areas, let's say. So we can be strong if we share the same understanding of democracy, of dignity, of solidarity, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before returning to the panel, let me extend now the questions to the audience, or from the audience. I haven't seen any. I do see first hand up there. I'll take about 3, and I kindly ask you for a short, succinct question. If there are for specific panelists, please indicate so.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Hello. Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Blanka Jamnišek. I'm one of the ambassadors of Slovenia. I've served in Vienna to the international organizations, and I am now the R2P responsibility to protect focal point, which means this, you're probably aware of that, what R2P is. Anyway, the title, How Many Futures for European Union, should be extended for Europe. In my personal opinion, we have to reach out. I was very happy to hear about enlargement, deepening, solidarity, and everything also what Mr. Peterle said, because without reaching out, we cannot have a great future just within the EU member states. We heard yesterday from Edi Rama that we didn't even offer vaccines to Albania at the time of the crisis. So these are the real concrete questions that concern our citizens in European Union and also in Europe, because we're very connected. There's so many diaspora from those countries in our own European member states. And now the question to all panelists is, how can we, as Mr. Peterle asked, enhance the political will and use also this diaspora to enhance the process of enlargement and deepening, because the talk show has been going on for 20 years almost, since Thessaloniki, for the Western Balkans at least, and we're still talking and we're still, offering the vision of Europe, but the world is changing. And we have a war in Europe again, which should have been prevented in the first place. But this is very, very serious now. So where is this political will that we could enhance? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So linking the two questions of the political will and enlargement. Now, my responsibility is to protect the time management of this panel. So do I see further questions? Now, given the timing, we won't have another round. So if there are no further questions, I will return to the panel and I'll invite you to pick and choose. You have two questions. They both can be answered at length or much shorter. We have 6 minutes. I'll ask you for a minute each, and then I'll turn to you and ask you, have you changed your mind with regard to Ares, Hermes, or Athena version of the future of Europe? For those who have joined after our initial video, remind yourselves of what these three Greek gods mean in, let's say, symbolic terms. Let me go in the same order as we've been proceeding from the start. Minister Byrne.
In terms of political will, I think the Citizens' Convention in Ireland was mentioned. And the Citizens' Convention, Constitutional Convention in Ireland over the last number of years actually gave politicians political will to deal with certain issues. And also, actually, we had similar forums after the Lisbon Treaty failed the first time, where we listened to the public and politicians were able to get some guidance from the people. But Ireland recently changed its abortion law. We had the first referendum in the world on marriage equality. These would not have happened, in my opinion, without that Citizens' Convention first actually giving politicians the political will. So before the Citizens' Convention on marriage equality, I don't know of any leader in the Irish Parliament before 2015 had said that they were in favour of marriage equality. That changed almost instantly after the Citizens' Convention. Similarly, with abortion. Lisbon Treaty as well, we listened to the public at that time, and the public many times are ahead of the politicians. And that the politicians become, and I'm a politician, we become brave when we know the public is with us. So we've got to do it, in my opinion, as much genuine listening to the public as possible. Now, I welcome the Conference on the Future of Europe. I thought it was very good, but I didn't think it was perfect. And I think it actually could be improved. And perhaps on certain specific issues, we could go back to that random citizen model on issues maybe such as defence, maybe such as tax, those issues that health, I don't know whether we have to go back to the citizens, but it's one we're very interested in. And that then drives agendas in Europe and drives politicians as well, that they feel confident that, that these ideas that probably they privately support have that public support. So I think that's one way. On the Western Balkans, from an Irish point of view, what we want to do is do as much as possible from the far west of the European Union to show solidarity to the region. We've got huge solidarity specifically on Brexit. You mentioned the other ones, COVID and Ukraine and all that. We've also taken the third highest number per capita of Ukrainian refugees on the far western shores of the European Union. So again, we want to show, from our point of view, not just solidarity, but genuine interest in the region. I think that that's one way that we can help to drive this process forward as much as we can.
State Secretary Štucin, ideas for concrete?
Yeah, I'll finish where Thomas ended. The question about political will, I think, is the crucial one. Mr. Peterle mentioned you'll have to sacrifice, you'll have to be solidar. And are we going to be more united out of it? Well, I'm afraid the answer is negative. But how we would concretely assure more political will? I think what Thomas also said, if the citizens would understand what European Union is already doing, then they would be more willing to sacrifice, to be united. The results of the consultations with the citizens, the conference, were that there's a huge percent of ideas that the citizens proposed were already implemented, and the citizens didn't know about it. So if we would tell them, look, we're doing this and this and this and this, I'm sure everybody, I mean, much more people would stand behind the European Union. On the Western Balkans, just maybe a short sentence. If we are pushing them away, then this is a breeding ground for nationalisms, for, I mean, of course those political elites would prosper in those, that are prospering in those conditions, so to say, are never going to do more to come closer to the European Union. So we shouldn't push them away, we should pull them in. That's my answer.
Thank you very much. This is a very long 1 minute. Let's continue in 1 minute.
My answer to Mr. Peterle, a very important question. I believe that we need a stronger, on enlargement, we need stronger strategic drive. Stronger strategic drive. When it comes geopolitical coordination in foreign affairs, how to deal with Russia, example. When it comes the political dimension, including governance and rule of law, but also when it comes dealing with economic and social issues, because this is much more than just preparing the access to a single market. This is about integrating these countries in all our European networks, in products, in services, in the digital, in energy transition, in education, in research, in culture, and also in health. I think this is unacceptable in a situation of pandemics that these countries are not given exactly the same conditions we have inside the European Union. So this is my vision about how to deal with enlargement, to take it seriously and to make it visible to citizens in these countries. My last point about treaty changes. This is the taboo question, but I'm at ease on this because I'm very proud that I was part of the team making the final negotiation of the Lisbon Treaty. I'm living in Lisbon, also in Brussels. We rescued the Constitutional Treaty somehow. We can do a lot of things with the Lisbon Treaty, a lot. There is a lot of potential, but there are also some limits. And that's why I consider that we need some target updates of the treaty to enable the European Union on strategic autonomy, capacity to decide, energy, foreign affairs, to move with the energy transition. And I'm afraid that the mechanisms we have foreseen, the passerelle and enhanced cooperation, which are there, are not effective enough. So, but I know this is for a second panel, not for now.
Indeed, for a second panel. João Klossa, on political will, I imagine, 60 seconds.
Political will, I fully agree with Thomas. And I think Ireland should make the proposal in order to, from the conference on the future of Europe, build something more effective and do it very quickly, because we need to empower political leaders. And this is key. And in addition to that, I think it's time to have a vision for 2049. We need to make a prospective exercise, because now we understand well the dynamic, which was not the case 1 or 2 years ago. And second, regarding European political community, the cost to have a country which do not share the same level of infrastructure is too high now. So we really need to have an investment plan to put everybody very rapidly at the same level. I repeat myself, the cost of a weak neighborhood around Europe is too high. Is too high. So we need to invest rapidly and massively. And this will be an answer to the enlargement.
Thank you very much. Charles Powell.
Very quickly, 2 points. First of all, as has already been said, we need to do more to help accession countries converge more quickly. Let's not forget, in 1994, we invented the European Economic Area to facilitate, to help EFTA countries come closer to our European economies. Admittedly, the EFTA countries were more developed than the Western Balkans, say, but this is a kind of model that we might keep in mind. Why not allow candidate countries to benefit from some of the 4 freedoms? By the way, we've already done this with Ukraine, as far as free movement of people is concerned. So we can be quite creative. And secondly, finally, last year you were worried about north-south, east-west tensions within the EU. Well, if there's one thing that we can thank Mr. Putin for, is that he is the greatest external federator that we have had in decades.
Thank you. Last word from the panel goes
Well,
to Charles.
on Charles's last point, I'm a little bit less optimistic. Yes, the EU has been united in response to the Ukraine war, but as the former minister said, Mr. Peterle, there are divisions. There are two schools of thought in the EU about how to handle Ukraine. There's the Baltic, Nordic, Polish school, which is isolate Russia, be incredibly tough, don't let their citizens into our countries. And there's the French, German, Italian school, which is to say, well, let's think that in the long run we're going to have a relationship with Russia, so let's not cut all our ties with them. Now, those two schools of thought are working together at the moment quite constructively. There hasn't been a great bust-up, but I do worry about that. And just very finally, on the Western Balkans, Charles is absolutely right. There's thinking in Paris and other places, and in Brussels, about allowing candidate countries to get some of the benefits of membership before they join. I think that's an excellent idea. That's not to be confused with the European political community. They should be kept apart, those two things. And on the political will point, I mean, we need better politicians leading our countries. We need more Macrons and more Mario Draghis, more people who think about the EU. You can't persuade citizens to follow paths towards greater integration without persuasive speakers, persuasive talkers who understand some of the issues. Most of the European leaders do not at all. Thank goodness there are people like Macron and Draghi who do. We need more of them.
Thank you very much. That concludes the panel, but not before I ask you for the temperature in the room. So at the beginning of the panel, I asked you whether you believe that the likely future, the scenario for the future of Europe in 2050 is the Eras one, as presented in the video at the beginning, or the Hermes one, or the Athena. So at the beginning, we had one hand up for Eras, which you can imagine was quite a bleak, dark 2050 in Europe. There were 12 hands up for Hermes, an economic integration, but without much political integration. And then Athena was, well, overwhelming majority. Let me check this now. A bleak, dark version for Europe in 2050. Eras, hands up. None. Congratulations. Hermes. We won't go into detail on that. Oh, Hermes. No, he didn't leave. Your hand is up now for Hermes. He didn't leave. That's about this. Now it's less. So I won't leave it to math, but let me see. Hands up for Athena. Yeah, it's not that overwhelming, I think, but thank you very much. I think it has been a persuasive panel. We did not enter technical discussions, but this is for the next time. I think we did open some things out of the box. I will not try to summarize, but maybe put forward just 3 things that I thought were coming in centrally. Widening and deepening are not either or, and they need to be done in parallel. If you look at the 23-24 June conclusions of the European Council, I'm not so sure they think it like that, but this panel certainly thought it like that. In deepening and widening, I think we agreed that we need 2 things at the same time. We need a process and we need results. There has to be results at the same time. And thirdly, we must not forget the European citizens in that story, the European or the EU citizens, and of course, the European values. And on that, and 5 minutes late than we were supposed to be, I would like to thank my wonderful panel. I'd like to ask you to join me in my thank note also to Mr. Peterle. And I wish you a good continuation of the Blitz Strategic Forum. Thank you.